Support for WGTD's morning show comes to you from Andrea's, a Kenosha tradition since 1911, a unique shopping experience time and time again, and that's what brings you back. And don't forget about Jack's Cafe. Andrea's, a proud supporter of WGTD's morning show. And we welcome you to the Wednesday morning show on WGTD HD, Kenosha, Racine, Elkhorn, and Lake Geneva, your gateway to public radio. I'm Gregory Berg. And this is a rare pleasure indeed for me to be speaking on the morning show with someone from my own family, a cousin of mine by the name of Kristian Berg. Kristian is a senior producer for Penn State Public Media, and for many years has been a documentarian. His resume includes work on the highly regarded PBS series Newton's Apple that some of you might remember from many years ago, for work on the series History Detectives. He's done a number of different films, documentaries, particularly around Native American themes. Several of Chris's films have actually aired on PBS nationwide. And he has crafted a beautiful documentary about a very intriguing artist. And this is a film which has achieved some notoriety, which has earned him some awards, including inclusion in the upcoming film festival in Green Bay. And it's a film called POUSTINIA, and it explores the legacy and work of a very gifted artist by the name of Gendron Jensen. And this is someone that Kristian and his parents and siblings knew growing up close together, I suppose, in northern Minnesota. And it is a really beautiful story about a most uncommon artist. And it's one of the loveliest films I think I've ever seen that brings to life the artistic process and the unique vision of this particular artist who has done highly regarded work for decades. And so it's a very personal film for Kristian and beautifully crafted in every respect. And I'm very excited that we can talk about it in a couple of different ways. We will talk about the film itself, and then eventually we'll be talking to the artist himself. But for now, to the filmmaker, to the director and producer of POUSTINIA, Kristian Berg, we welcome you to the morning show.
Oh, thank you very much, Greg.
Hi, cousin.
Yeah, I've been following your show online, and it's really a thrill for me. We should start with the title. It's a Serbian word, which is pronounced POUSTINIA.
Yeah, I didn't quite nail that, did I? And but I love its definition. It's explained in the course of the film, and it's a notion that's obviously very important to Mr. Jensen.
Yeah. He found that term. It's used in the Eastern Church a lot, and it's where the monks go to get their spiritual visions, and they often fast and pray, and he finds that in his subject matter, and he draws bones in pencil. Pencil, he has said, because it's accessible to people. He wishes no barrier between himself and the people. And they take the form of very large pencil drawings of skeletal remains from nature. He's been called the Bone Man. And for a time, these were usually 4 feet by 7 feet in size. I mean, and with subjects like a vertebrae from a deer, or half a black walnut shell, the hip bone of a grasshopper, all from nature. And he wants people to look into nature when they see the artwork, to look into nature, not just at the surface of a two-dimensional drawing. And you get that sense because he really has an uncanny eye for detail. I mean, you might be looking at like a drawing by Chuck Close, but unlike Close, he doesn't use any photographic aids. I mean, it's just his two eyes, a pencil, and a piece of paper. And he can draw these tiny objects to these epic sizes.
Right. I just finished, just now as we're recording this interview, I just finished a live morning show with a local biology professor, Professor Greg Mayer. And he arrived late enough to the studio that I wasn't able to show him just a few moments from your film, but I thought he would be very interested because of his background in biology, which he is, and I hope someday he'll get to see this film. But as we just briefly chatted about it, he said something to the effect that in many cases, drawings can be more valuable than photographs in terms of scientific importance. I mean, not that that's why Gendron Jensen does what he does, or certainly not with that primary purpose in mind, but that in fact a beautifully rendered drawing often reveals details that, especially once upon a time, a photograph never would have been able to do.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because he very well could be a scientific artist. And he, just as a layman, he has such a thorough knowledge of all the scientific terms for all the bones and the positioning of the bones. I mean, he has a great kinship with naturalists and has, in fact, been an artist in residence at the Smithsonian in the bone rooms that hold these huge whale bones. So his interest in pursuing his subject matter has taken him a number of interesting places. But for the most part, it was just up there in northern Minnesota. That was really where he formed his vision. It was 17 years, and I first met him when I was 8 or 9 years old. He had his first art show in the fellowship hall of Dad's church, your Uncle Paul.
Right.
And it was a series of milk pails, old rusted-out milk pails that he found on his family's rented farm. And he titled the series "I Thirst." A lot of religious references, both religious and Native American, because he actually has some Native heritage, which he won't talk about very much, but will come out in certain ways. Like he'll name his drawings with Anishinaabe names, from the Ojibwe people.
Have you remained close to him over all these years, or in deciding to make this film, were you then needing to reconnect with him?
I've kept in touch with him the whole time. I have letters from him when I was in college in the early '80s, and corresponding with Gendron is a gift. It's really a blessing, because it's a lost art, the correspondence, writing physical letters, and he's still down there in New Mexico, pounding out letters on a manual Royal typewriter. And he also used to hand write his letters, and he has incredible handwriting. And sometimes you'll even get a bit of a drawing on a letter. And I've kept in touch with him, the whole time. He was great friends with my father, and when Gendron would show works, oftentimes the sermon would be based on the theme of what Gendron was working on.
So tell us about anything in particular that prompted you to want to craft this film tribute to him. Did anything in particular that he did or said prompt this, or did it just spring out of this long friendship and admiration, and did it just feel like the right thing to do?
Well, it's interesting. I actually did some shooting with him when I was a senior in high school. This was on old Sony reel-to-reel black and white videotape, and all that footage is gone now. But his persona has always fascinated with me. I mean, he is so reverent to his subject matter, and it's a very spiritual approach that he takes to his work. And so I always wanted to tell this story. And then a couple of filmmakers from upstate New York found out about him too and started working on their own documentary. And I felt a little put out, and I said, well, I've known him since I was a kid. I should work on this. And I volunteered and started actually shooting with Gendron. He moved to New Mexico in 1987, which is a love story in itself. I mean, he fell in love in his late 40s and got married for the first time to another artist and then moved down to New Mexico to be with her. So when I got involved with this other filmmakers project, I volunteered and would gather crews together and usually volunteers. And we would shoot with Gendron when he came back to visit to Minnesota. He would come back maybe to lecture at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, or he'd go up to the farm in Grand Rapids, and we'd trek up there into the woods and shoot various scenes with him. But this project was envisioned as a feature-length documentary, and it never got any traction. And at one point, I had an opportunity to go down to New Mexico with a crew and do some shooting, and I said, Gendron is over 70 now. I really need to make this while he's still with us and vital. And so I just made a pact with myself that I would finish a story with whatever came out of that shoot. And so we did all the principal interviews, and we went out on the bone hunts with him up into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And then my director of photography was able to go back down and document the process of stone lithography. He was doing a series of a triptych on wolf bones based on King Arthur and his two most trusted knights. And so we were able to actually capture this arcane process, which is actually a 19th century German process on these giant mother stones. And this was a fascinating development in his artistic life, because he had always drawn graphite pencil on paper, and then when he was around 50, he learned how to draw on these big mother stones to produce these giant lithographs.
One of the things that I most enjoy about this film is that you have chosen, I think, just the right sort of color and mood for it. It's a quiet film, and by no means action-packed in the way that some films or even documentaries can be kind of action-packed. It's a quiet, very serene film, and yet it's a very full film. And I mean, not the least bit boring. I mean, one does not nod off as you watch this film. I mean, it's very, very engaging. But I'm impressed at the way in which you seem to choose exactly the right flavor. Could you just say a word about that, about what it means as you are about to put a film together in terms of trying to sort of get at what the heart of it is going to be, and in this case, how you were able to sort of come up with that?
Well, the dichotomy between the North Woods and his development there, and it was almost a monastic kind of beginning for him as an artist. In fact, monastic literally, because he first wanted to be a monk, and he was at a Benedictine monastery in Wisconsin, and he was kicked out over some political friction, and so I showed it to an art professor here at Penn State, and he was struck by the relationship between a monastic life and the life of a studio artist, which is in many ways very solitary and meditative. And so I wanted the first part of that film to be his life and his development from what I remembered from my childhood. And we would go out to Gendron's parents' farm, and I'd go up into his bone room, and it was a strange and wondrous experience. You walk in here and there's bones everywhere. and then he would pick them up and tell stories about little skulls or giant vertebrae, and so I wanted the first half of the film to be that, and then his new life and rebirth in New Mexico. I mean, I say rebirth, but it was really kind of a romantic flowering for his life, and I wanted to capture the flavor of that as well, and his development, and his recognition. So some of this was driven just by some of the opportunities that were presented to me, and one of those was him getting his first New York show at age 70, and I was able to just grab my own camera and fly down there and document it, and so it was driven, I think, by the opportunities and by this desire to tell these two chapters in his life.
One thing I love about the film is that we are not only shown a bit of those moments when he finds bones out in the woods, and he talks about the shiver it gives him, like falling in love again, I think he says at one point. But then beyond that, we are shown some of the time that he spends with that he gathers. I think he uses words like beholding, mutely gazing. I mean, he will take these things in hand, and he will look at them, it sounds like, for hours at a time, and spinning them into every conceivable direction before he ever begins sketching them. And again, what you were saying about how there are ways in which his artistic life perhaps mirrors in some ways the monastic life, that's where we really see it in some of these moments where he is doing exactly this.
Yeah, and he has a remarkable ability to express himself. You talk about some of the words that he uses. His wife, Christine Taylor Patton, who's a very accomplished artist herself, she laughs and says, if there's not a word in the English language that expresses what he's feeling, he'll make up one. Or he'll cobble one together from a number of different words. And he does. He speaks like a poet, and he kind of reminds one of Thoreau, having lived out among nature, and that's where he gets his inspiration. That's where he sees the connection to the eternal, is through these bones. I mean, he sees them as and describes them as estuaries unto exaltation. I mean, this is the kind of language that you hear when you're hanging out with Gendron. It's a wonderful experience.
He also has something interesting to say. I think this is towards the very end of the film when he takes issue with those who would say that somebody who spends nearly every waking moment of their professional lives sketching bones is on some sort of death trip. And he takes exception to that and chooses to describe it a different way.
Yeah, there's no death without life. Yeah. And I remember being, as a kid, just staring at his drawings. I mean, there's such dimension to them. He has a real gift for detail and perspective, and they almost look surreal, but they're not. I mean, they look surreal because they almost look like alien landscapes because of his choices and the way that he positions things. He'll position a small bone in a piece of plasticine clay about 18 inches from him, and then he'll turn on a small 20-watt light bulb in an old gooseneck lamp, and he's had the same lamp for almost 40 years. And that's the way he draws. And then he can describe to you, what goes on between him and his object, his subject. But it's remarkable.
I thought in particular it was interesting how he liked to say in the film that these bones are not static to me, and really when you think about it, there's probably not a more still life than if somebody sketches bones. I mean, that in a sense, seems even more of a still life and a lifeless thing than sketching a bowl of fruit. But he looks at these objects and he sees life instead of death.
Yeah, it's almost a pun. It's almost like the still life is still life. I mean,
I never thought of that.
Yeah, and my editor, Greg Feinberg, did such a wonderful job. It was his idea to then animate those bones, and he had a series of primary sketches, because Gendron will do like primary, secondary, and then final sketches of almost every work that he does. And so he was able to take these primary sketches and give them movement. And in fact, he did the illustrations for Robert Bly's book in 1977 called This Body is Made of Camphor and Gopher Wood, which is a reference to Noah's Ark. And he chose freshwater snails, and he positions them so that if you flip the pages, the snail kind of turns and lies over on its side. And so that was an obvious animation for us, so we were able to pick up on someone's mention of the book and what he did with those snails and to recreate that movement. And so that's, of course, the benefit of film.
Of course.
And of course, we'd be fools not to take advantage of that quality.
Right. And, of course, we're speaking about something almost entirely visual over the radio, which is no small feat. One of the things I appreciate about the film is a couple different aspects of its sound. One of them is that you've very nicely chosen the music which animates the film. And at the very beginning, the first image we see and the first sound we hear is of Gendron Jensen sketching, and we hear the sound of the pencil against the paper. And that goes on for a little bit of time. And that's a very, very powerful moment, because in a sense there couldn't be anything simpler or more central to who he is and to what this film is about.
Yeah. The image maker. That's him.
I suppose it was, you had to have felt a special mantle of responsibility in that this was such a personal film. This was about someone not only whom you know, but someone you love. And I should think you wanted to make a film that he would appreciate and that would help the rest of the world appreciate him and his work the way you do. In that respect, was this kind of an emotionally exhausting project for you?
Yeah, it was such a relief to finish and to finally screen it. I mean, Gendron has been like a member of the family. I mean, he carried my dad's casket at his funeral and carved the cross that's on his grave. And this is, he is family, and I've really wanted to tell this story, but Gendron's never been one for he's never really been a publicity hound, so he's always been a fairly solitary. He's very social, but I mean, very solitary in his focus on his work, and that focus really does require a fair amount of solitude.
So tell our listeners the kind of attention that this film has generated for you.
Well, it's done pretty well. We're really happy that it's up in Green Bay, which is Saturday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. in Green Bay. And the first festival it was accepted into was the Woodstock Film Festival last October, and that was really thrilling. We had 2 screenings, well attended, and it also won the jury prize for Best Short Documentary. And we're going to be out in the Taos Shorts Film Festival and the Sebastopol Documentary Film Festival in California, end of March. And I'm hoping that it'll make its way finally to public television at some point in some form. But we've been very, very heartened and grateful for the reaction that it's gotten.
Say the name of the title one more time.
POUSTINIA.
Poustinia, which again is a term which refers to, part of that word, that Slavic word, refers to house or home, And it's a term then that refers to our own spiritual grounding. And this film, POUSTINIA, tells the work of artist Gendron Jensen. Kristian Berg, its director and producer, and my cousin. Kristian, it was great to speak with you about this beautiful film. Thank you for joining me.
And to you, Greg. Thank you.
And now I'm delighted to share with you an interview I recorded with artist Gendron Jensen, who was born and raised in Minnesota, but who now lives and works in Vadito, New Mexico. He spoke to me via telephone from his beautiful home there, where he continues to seek out lovely, intriguing natural objects and sketches them. I began the interview by asking him if he has always had this interest in objects from the natural world around him.
I was always doing that ever since I was a little boy. You know, I seemed, it was something instinctive. I think for the real things, Greg, we don't have to be talked into whatever it is. It just comes of its own. And there is a method to everyone's madness, so to speak, in that we find our rigor. We find the yoke of our habitual disposition, our inclination, into whatever it is we make sense of it with, you know, however we fashion it. I'm self-taught in the medium of pencil on paper, and I'm monolithic in my thinking because that's really it for me, to draw and to behold with my bioptic embrace all that rounds the seeable around me. And it's a feast, man, and it's for free. There are other things for which we pay a terrible price sometimes, especially when it comes to our health. If we have good health, we should be on our knees each day in thanksgiving to have a sound body. And we hope to have, on surmounting that, a sound mind. And then an inclination to create for other than self. My dear mother always said, do your best, live to have done a good thing by your existence, but most of all, live more on behalf of other than self. I think that's a pretty good way to go, you know. But I did ponder from early awakening years. It's a long story, you know. I can't go into it right now with you, but maybe at some later date we'll have a chance.
One of the points of your life that is mentioned in the film is how you went to, I believe, a monastery. Was it an Anglican monastery?
It's right down below you there on the state line near Antioch, Illinois.
Okay, I've been right past it. I've never been on the property, but I have driven right past it. I know exactly what we're talking about then.
It's St. Benedict's Abbey, Bennett Lake, Wisconsin.
Right. And you were eventually, I guess the frankest way to say it is you were asked to leave, to essentially return home.
Yes.
And I wonder, I mean, from the way you describe it, it clearly was a painful experience at the time. I suppose in some respects you look at that very differently now, because for all the pain it caused you in the moment, it also set you on this journey which has ensued ever since.
Yes, it was begun there, Greg, right down there in that rivering moraine. It's pre-glacial down there. It's just wonderful, and there are fossils in the fields. And I could hunt, and I worked in the print shop as a layman for 4 years. And then I did my own work in the after hours. And so I began by working up a series that shows up partially in the documentary. Each of the drawings is 5 by 6 feet. And they're of the fauna and flora that I found going around Bennett Lake on the shores and up in through the fields and the hardwoods there. I hunted a great deal and gathered from the midden heap from nature those things left to my use by the creatures that have once inhabited those relics. And it was such an enthralling time, but the bubble had to pop. It was time to go, and push came to shove. And I really love those monks, those wonderful monks. And there's a long tradition in the monastic realm where from early Christendom, the monasteries were asylums, refuges, especially in the Dark Ages, for artisans and artists to come to work. And they celebrated the creative. The Benedictine tradition goes back to Nursia in Italy, and I think in the 500s and the 6th century. And the monks there under Saint Benedict thrived, unbrokenly down to the present time. And so I have a real love for those monks. Surely some of them are like chosen brothers to me. So I look back fondly upon that, even though at the time it was traumatic to have to leave.
And of course, in some respects, the contemplative life of a monk doesn't seem all that different from some of what you have experienced and continue to experience as an artist, in terms of the solitude that is involved, the quiet contemplation of all kinds of things, but particularly these beautiful objects that so many of us rush past and never take the time to take in hand and look at with discernment and with real deep appreciation. I wonder if you could say a word about those years that you spent back up in Minnesota. Many of them lived alone. Were those ever lonely times for you, or were you alone but not lonesome because you were perfectly happy?
In the Japanese language, I've heard they have many, many scores of words that denote degrees of solitude. And in English, we have lonely, alone, and being by oneself, which I would call the epitome. If I can get to a place of feeling contented in that state, in that inclination, it's wonderful, because the creative act is a solitary act, Greg. And so I always, look for that time out of time, when the clocks and calendars fly away, and it's only me and my hardihood, the sweet yolk of whatever it is that comes forth through my eyes and hands. One old monk told me one time, make sure you keep your heart between your hands and your eyes as you look and as you create.
You spent many, many years in beautiful northern Minnesota, and then many years after that, down in the southwest part of the United States in New Mexico. I wonder if you could say a word about those two very different places, those two very different landscapes, and how your own artistry was affected, or essentially have you been the same artist even in those two very, very different places?
It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. So I can tell you, dear man, that when I was in the Northwoods, I fell into a rhythm. And of course there it's down closer to sea level, there along the mighty Mississippi River, as she rolls her way down toward the Gulf of Mexico out of New Orleans, there into the Gulf. There's a hushed light there. And here, when I came here, I was in a swoon, because here we have trumpeting, bugling light, exaltative light that chases and devours the shadows. But the light back in the Northwoods is evanescent, is gossamer, it's subtle. The first long letter that I wrote to Christine was a 15-page letter about rebounding light. It's after the morning of the first snow, waking up, when all the light is referentially rebounded, and everything seems to fly over the surface of the snowy ground, the snow-strewn ground. And the ceilings become bathed in that light. So I always kept my windows unshrouded ahead of that time, and it was a heightened time of excitement, more than Christmas morning, so to speak. And so there is a different light, and there's a different rhythm. I had different stories there. Now the song that I sing is of my beloved. Christine is my life. She is my greatest teacher. We learn from those whom we love and by whom we are loved. And she is a ever-flowing font of wisdom and grace, and she knows how to kick me good and hard where I need it. At times, she can take me to task like no one else.
She, of course, is also an artist and one who, it's described in the film by you, I think, is one who more draws from within, as opposed to you drawing inspiration. In a sense, externally, you find things around you, and so the two of you create beautiful things, albeit in very different ways.
That's a good way to say it. What I say about Christine is, if Johann Sebastian Bach had drawn, he would have to be Christine Taylor Patton. And, of course, he worked with music, which is sound, which is as elusive as light. And I've always said that Christine lays hold of the light and apprehends the wind. It's as if she can capture these things because they come from forth within her. But I'm always referred outside of myself. And in the alchemy of whatever that is that makes that image come into what I hope for is an ideal of the form as I've seen it, I change the scale of some of the bones, and to create the balance, the knitness, I have to alter things very subtly, but I never distort what I see. Nature doesn't lie. The bones have never been liars to me. They speak the truth, a wonderful truth.
One of the bits of, I guess we could say, advice which you share towards the very end of the film is when you tell us all, or anybody who particularly maybe seeks to be an artist, but probably all of us should heed the advice to be open. Be open.
Yeah.
As you look at your own life, do you feel like you have always been open, or have there been certain times in your life or certain circumstances in which you have been especially open? And I guess I ask that because that might be helpful to some of the rest of us maybe who are less inclined to be open in our own lives.
This openness has a duality behind it within the eye of the beholder, the perceiver. The Native Americans had a different disposition. I'm even finding it through the Ojibwe language because I have 4 dictionaries. And I only could look over the words and cross-references for suffixes and prefixes thereof indicate a deep, deep awaring, seeing, not just a being, but a seeing that was ever there, that all that they perceived in the outer world visually was an extension of their own selves. You know, the perceiver and the perceived, the observer and the observed, the seer and the seen become one. And I have moments like that, and it's mostly in the act of drawing, that all the barriers go away, and suddenly I'm transported, and I meet somewhere. There's some place of meeting, some ground of meeting, and that's out of which I've been able to conjure the drawings in succession. And usually the bones summons me. They say the second person singular, you. They call me forth, and then I have to answer them. And the only way I can come out of it, that I can get away with it, is to draw. I have no other recourse but to draw. And being open, though, the duality for me is between biddenness and unbiddenness. The only bidden part of my life are the drawings I've created. Everything else is necessarily unbidden. I have to stay open for whatever it is that will come into my visual awareness, my pansensory awareness. I just drew a leg bone of a moose to a friend, and we were canoeing in the provincial Ontario forest there in Canada, in the Quetico, last summer. I hadn't been canoeing for 30 years, and I was with one of my old buddies, and we saw this bone there raining like in some kingly splendor was this wonderful relic astride a huge boulder right down in the water. And I don't like to move the bones very quickly because they came to rest there through whatever alchemy in the natural. I think it was probably carried there by a wolf, and that the critter had been downed on the ice because they can't purchase, to gain momentum with their hooves as easily on the ice, of course, unless there's snow over it. But there was that bone, and I just drew it for this friend on a huge piece of wrapping paper. And I told him in there I could see again the glory of magenta orchids, the moccasin flowers that were in wonderful little shy colonies in the inlets, the dank inlets, especially on the south shores where the overshadowing of the mossy cliffs kept them in the shade for most of the season. And it was June, early June, when they bloom. And I could, of course, hear the loons, and then I could see again the moon dancing on the nearly stilled waters of evening down from our campsite, and hear the voices of my comrades. I think nature is the great equalizer. Greg, you go forth on uneven ground, and it will do you nothing but good. And if you go with your friends, that's why I like the explorers in the Arctic and Antarctic. The human looms very largely in the natural, especially when we go forth away from the settled world, as they called it back in those golden ages of exploration, to go back among the supposedly civilized. Instead, we're out there where one move could mean death, one wrong move. So to go out there and keep our wits about us, wonderful things open up. But they are all unbidden. We can't say, I'm going to now go over into that cove and find the complete skeleton of a cow elk on the west shore of that cove over there across the lake. We can't do it. We are taken by surprise forever.
It's literally stepping into the unknown,
yes,
and being ready for whatever comes.
Yeah,
that's certainly
that's unbidden.
It's certainly an abiding theme of this beautiful film made about you by my cousin Kristian Berg. Again, the film POUSTINIA, which is going to be screened at the Green Bay Film Festival on Saturday, the 22nd of February. A beautiful, beautiful film in every single way. And Gendron Jensen, I am so happy to have this opportunity to speak with you and learn more about what your life has meant to you, and it makes me appreciate the film all the more. And I appreciate you joining me today on the morning show. It was a privilege to speak with you, and best wishes to you.
As well for me, and wonderful wishes. May your path be wonderfully unfurling before you ever.